go back to sleep, Rahaf. We're so tired.
Free Palestine, free Congo, free Sudan, free Yemen, free Hawaii, free Guam. Beyond a ceasefire, we need an end to the occupation. It's deeper than this. We need everybody that's here right now, everybody that's watching, to step up to use their voices.
It should not be controversial to say that we should all be against murdering civilians.
We all we got, so I'm gonna leave that there.
Hello, hi, and how are you? Welcome back to another episode of Referential. My name is Dr. Cardenas, and thank you so much for tuning in. This is video episode 5, Ancient Hatred. I apologize about the sound of my voice. I have been a bit run down lately because life has been a lot, as I'm sure you know. So, updates from my day today. I just got off the phone with a relative who was sheltering in place because the sirens were going off from the missiles going overhead from Iran to Qatar. This, of course, is in response to the US and Israel's hostile actions in the region recently. So yeah, it is a dangerous time to be an Arab in the world. A lot has been happening, and it is literally getting closer and closer to home for me. Less bleak, I recently had the chance to offline sit down and share a coffee with a fellow queer Arab immigrant making their way in the UK today and working in media. They're a fantastic drag king and event producer. You can find their work online at The Prince of Persia. Just replace the E in Persia with the number 3. You'll hopefully get to hear their voice on the feed very, very soon. We kind of spent our time commiserating about our experiences as queer Arab people living in the West in this present moment and being people whose work is often somehow related to an aspect of their identity. I was and am really awestruck by how loudly they stood within their work as an Arab person and their relationship to visibility. I try very hard to push conversations in this podcast to what I think are areas in media discourse and critique that are overlooked and under-addressed. But that sit down really did make me think about how careful I can be when talking about specifically my Arab identity. And I've been thinking that that might be because of how I feel like I have to work harder in the West to contextualize that aspect of myself. And the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of narrative layers that you have to peel away when discussing Arab people and cultures. But what is really frustrating is how often that fact is used as an excuse to avoid having the conversation and instead just settle into some dehumanizing and violent position. About a year ago now, I sat down with my good friend Dr. Jonathan Galton. I'd wanted to talk to him about a chapter of the book that he's been working on for a while now. And after hearing then President Joe Biden give a speech about anti-Zionism, Palestine, and the region's anti-Semitic, quote-unquote, ancient hatreds, it felt like the time to hit record. If you've forgotten that speech, it was delivered by the former president of the United States in a keynote address at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's annual Day of Remembrance ceremony in 2024. And here's a clip.
This ancient hatred of Jews didn't begin with the Holocaust. It didn't end with the Holocaust either, or even after our victory in World War II. This hatred continues to lie deep in the hearts of too many people in the world and requires our continued vigilance and outspokenness. That hatred was brought to life on October 7th in 2023. On the sacred Jewish holiday, the terrorist group Hamas unleashed the deadliest day of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Driven by ancient desire to wipe out the Jewish people off the face of the earth, over 1,200 innocent people, babies, parents, grandparents, slaughtered in a kibbutz, massacred at a music festival, brutally raped, mutilated, and sexually assaulted. Thousands more carrying wounds, bullets and shrapnel from the memory of that terrible day they endured. Hundreds taken hostage, including survivors of the Shoah. Now, here we are, not 75 years later, but just 7.5 months later, and people are already forgetting. They're already forgetting that Hamas unleashed this terror. It was Hamas that brutalized Israelis. It was Hamas who took and continues to hold hostages. I have not forgotten, nor have you, and we will not forget.
There's so much going on here, I don't know where to start. I think first hearing the speech, what hit me was the way that it allowed for an understanding for an ancient animus as being the direct result of this moment, rather than the decades-long histories of documented conflict, occupation, and aggression. An animus which, by the way, I do feel the need to clarify to believe to be very, very real in this world. Jewish people and communities have been met with the worst of humanity throughout recorded history and probably definitely beyond. What I take issue with is the way that is being rhetorically incorporated and located within Arab and Muslim communities in the West. The way that it obfuscates the interests and identity of Jewish people throughout the world with that of the position and ambitions of the Israeli state or some imagined citizen. And then there's the way that it seeks to silence any commentary and nuance by associating complicating viewpoints with the barbarianism of the German Nazi and the collaborators who helped them perpetuate the Holocaust. Actually, here's another clip. This one featuring New York mayoral candidates Brad Lander and Zahran Mamandi being interviewed by the occasionally politically flavored talk show host Stephen Colbert. And of course, Israel, anti-Semitism, and Palestine pop up in the conversation.
And so I'll ask the same question to both of you. I'll start with you, Mr. Lander. Does the state of Israel have the right to exist?
I support the vision of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state.
Mr. Mamdani, same question. Does the state of Israel have the right to exist?
Yes, like all nations, I believe it has a right to exist and a responsibility also to uphold international law.
Okay, well, let's talk about the elephant in the room, is that there are many people in New York, even people who would support your candidacy otherwise, who don't want to support you because of the Jewish community's fear of the true and rising anti-Semitism, not only around the world, but in this country and shamefully in New York, which is the largest Jewish population of any city other than Tel Aviv in the whole world. And they are worried, they're very upset by some of the things that you've said in the past, and they're afraid that your mayorship would actually lead to increased anti-Semitism, that they believe that that would be more dangerous for them. What do you say to those New Yorkers who are afraid that you wouldn't be their mayor, that you wouldn't protect them?
You know, I know where that fear is coming from. It's a fear that is based upon the horrific attacks we've seen in Washington, D.C., in Boulder, Colorado. It's
all the way from Jews will not replace us to today.
And it's a fear that I hear also from New Yorkers themselves. You know, just a few days after the horrific war crime of October 7th, a friend of mine told me about how he went to his synagogue for Shabbat services, and he heard the door open behind him, and a tremor went up his spine as he turned around not knowing who was there and what they meant for him. I spoke to a Jewish man in Williamsburg just months ago who told me that the door he left unlocked for decades is now one that he locks. And ultimately, this is because we're seeing a crisis of anti-Semitism. And that's why at the heart of my proposal for Department of Community Safety is a commitment to increase funding for anti-hate crime programming by 800%. Because to your point, anti-Semitism is not simply something that we should talk about, it's something that we have to tackle. We have to make clear there's no room for it in this city, in this country, in this world.
And no justification for violence of any kind?
No, there's no room for violence in this city, in this country, in this world. And what I have found also from many New Yorkers is an ability to navigate disagreement. You know, I remember the words of Mayor Koch, who said, if you agree with me on 9 out of 12 issues, vote for me. 12 out of 12, see a psychiatrist. And I had an older Jewish woman come up to me at B'nai Jeshurun in a synagogue many months ago after a Democratic Club forum. And she whispered in my ear, I disagree with you on one issue. I'm pretty sure you know which one it is. And I agree with you on the others, and I'm going to be ranking you on my ballot. And I say this because I know there are many New Yorkers with whom I have a disagreement about the Israeli government's policies. And also, there are many who understand that that's a disagreement still rooted in shared humanity. Because the conclusions I've come to, they are the conclusions of Israeli historians like Amos Goldberg. They are echoing the words of an Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, who said just recently, what we are doing in Gaza is a war of devastation. It is cruel, it is indiscriminate, it is limitless, it is criminal killing of civilians. These are the conclusions I've come to.
Stephen, can I sure, please.
So here's everything that I hear when listening to that clip. First of all, Mamdani gave a great answer. Second, Colbert's questioning somehow both erases the experiences and realities of Palestinian people and is founded on the idea that as Muslim, Mamdani is anti-Semitic. He has to justify his belonging in this mayoral race, in the culture, and hell in the country too. Brad Lander sitting next to him while Colbert is speaking for all New York Jewish people only makes the subtext of this exchange even more striking to me. Remember what I said earlier about needing to constantly contextualize yourself and living in the West against dehumanizing narratives? And I've not even personally brought in my queerness into it yet. This episode is hopefully the start of us having some of these tough conversations when it comes to the way that Arab people are being discussed in the West in media today. Dr. Jonathan Galton is a lecturer at UCL currently teaching sociology and social science at the IOE Social Research Institute. His first book, Fake Gods and False Histories, is out now for free, and you can find a link to that in the show notes. He's currently working on his second with the working title of Does Islamo-Leftism Exist? British Left-Muslim Connections Beyond the Caricature. You'll hear it referred to as Does the Left Have a Muslim Problem in the conversation. We talk about old anti-Zionism, new anti-Semitism, Palestine as a quote-unquote left-wing cause, and the left's quote-unquote Muslim and Arab problem. This is part 2 of the Imperial Sessions series of talking fascism in media, part 2 of probably, unfortunately, many more. Slightly more serious one this time. You'll notice a lot less clips and edits in this one as well. It's a bit more free talk. Shout out to Layla for pitching in on the edit. Working on this episode has been really good for my mental health in this moment. So I hope that you also get something out of it. I hope that it helps you start some new conversations with people, conversations that we should have been having a long time ago. Yeah. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you back here in the end.
The weekend after, I went down to Faversham to record it.
Oh, nice. How was that process?
Lovely. I mean, it's the third album I've done with him, and his wife Ali is the violinist, who played
Yes.
with me. She and I did one together, and I've done a previous solo piano one. There's been quite a delay in getting any sort of files back. He finally sent me something the other night, and the piano sound was wonderful, but one of the microphones was very close into the piano, so you could hear the hammers as well.
Does it add to it, or does it take away from it?
It takes away from it. So Borrowed Light, which is the penultimate piece of that piano set, as I'm sure you will recall from the starts with the very...
The one that went la la la.
It almost did actually. Yada, da, la, 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 yada. But it's a very simple solo piano line. But it just sounds like there's a drummer kind of going alongside.
I'll keep that part.
Yeah.
I like to maintain an air of music. I always said that the finale of the first season is going to be a musical episode. I've not worked it out exactly how I want. Obviously sampling old episodes.
Yeah.
You know, and
Yeah.
like making songs of little freight, whatever.
Wow.
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 Yeah, I think I'll be very upset if you don't include that now.
Is that, or like trying to get people to sing, try to actually do like a musical?
I mean, judging by the problems we've had setting up 2 microphones in this room, I don't
Well, the
have
thing is, I can...
huge faith.
Well, I have friends who are more proficient with actual audio tech.
Where are they now?
I'm fucking touring. That's the issue. My friend Joey's touring. You know the Irreplaceable? He's the bassist now.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, for the new Yo Homo tour that they're doing. But they've been really excited as well because
yes.
they're like, I have a stylist. And I'm just like, I want a stylist.
I want a stylist. Yeah, I love a stylist.
Would you style? Like, what? I don't know. Gendered. I just gendered her.
Yes, what would they?
She was.
Yeah.
It is a she, though.
Yeah. but your notional stylist could be anyone. So,
Exactly.
Yeah.
I want to like look different.
Yeah.
Like a real fucked up aesthetic. Like there's a gap in the culture.
Yeah.
I told you earlier, I was watching Mr. McMahon. I just binged the whole thing because it was there. I was like, I'm going to watch this to try and get podcasting out of my head. I just want to rest.
Mm-hmm.
And then the segment in one of the episodes where they went into, I think in the 80s, they had this wrestler-themed Iraqi.
Nice.
And then they were like, yeah, we did that because, of the Kuwait War.
Yeah.
And I was like, why is that okay? And they just like put out there, like, and if you look back at it, it's not okay now, and it's really problematic. Moving on. And I'm just like, no. Stay here. Talk more.
Did your referential antennae go out there? And
I was like, oh my god.
A podcast about this.
I just wanted one break from anti-Arab hysteria.
Yeah.
Just one moment in my life.
No, but I find when you try to escape something,
It'll
you
come
almost
find you.
always come. Yeah, exactly.
What have you been trying to escape lately? Your book?
My book, really. Yeah. And because my book's pretty much about everything.
You're just seeing anti-Semitism everywhere.
Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia,
You're loving
queer stuff. I love it. I mean, it's just there. How can I perpetuate all these phobias? But
like, I'm going to write a whole encyclopedia of racism.
Absolutely, yes. Anti this, phobia that.
So that's the other thing is that about my podcast is that I don't really have an intro. My friend Connor, he was really disoriented. Like, so what are we doing? Are we just talking? And I was like, yeah, we're just talking.
Yeah.
We're just going to I'm going to splice this in here. And he's like, I hate it. I hate your podcast for this. Like, this is the thing I hate about your podcast. I was like, I get it. I really should have like a proper intro to get you into the mood of it. I do like splicing this and obviously I mentioned my friend Connor because he's Jewish.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to establish that I have a big, vibrant Jewish friendship community.
Great. Yes.
Say no, please don't come for me for whatever this episode ends up being.
Yeah. It's alright, I have Muslim friends.
You have Muslim friends?
Yeah, I have Muslim friends.
Just the one?
Black friends. Yeah, exactly.
I try not to have Muslim friends.
Yeah. In fact, you're everything Muslim, black, queer. You tick all the boxes for me. So.
I am the quota. Like, I do think about that. Oh, I am like that person probably for a lot of my friends. My friends aren't like this, but like I could be that person where like if anyone like interrogates them, do you have any black friends? I'd be like, call it. I'm like, oh fuck.
Do you have any queer friends? Do you have any Muslim friends? Yeah. No, yeah.
What can you do? My whole life I've been a statistic for people.
I remember reading some article by some sort of smarmy white guy who probably thought he was an anti-racist for saying this, that he said whenever anyone tells him, oh, I'm not racist because I've got black friends, which is obviously an egregious thing to say, but whenever anyone says that, he then insists on their getting their phone out there and calling them. I thought, well, if I was the black friend, whether or not they existed, I would find it really weird if some man was up saying, excuse me, can you confirm that you are friends with this guy?
I wonder how many people have been put in that situation. I haven't been, thankfully, so far. Maybe that just means I make better choices in friends.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are ways to unpick the idea of I'm not racist, I've got black friends. I don't think that's it.
We'd also talked about this earlier. But speaking of black friends, you are technically my first white guest on a main episode.
I'm so honoured.
Welcome.
So honoured. Thank you.
Diversity
hire.
The only first one I'm recording with. So, how do you feel?
Yeah, I'm feeling
honoured.
Yeah.
How does it feel being the first?
The first. I feel I've got to represent my people.
Do you feel like you finally breaking that ceiling?
Yeah.
Opened a door for other.
Worry.
Actually? Let's start there. What are you exactly? Please tell me how you identify fully. I want race, ethnicity, age.
So we want to just
gender.
Really essentialize me into boxes. I am a cisgendered male. Very happy to say that. Uses he, him pronouns.
I don't like how happy you are to say that.
No, I'm very happy. I'm very happy just to sort of delineate that without sort of having to qualify things further.
Problematic, but let's move on.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's just keep
Fine.
it there.
Fine.
Okay.
Okay.
Keep going.
What else do you want to know?
You're a Jewish academic as well.
A Jewish academic.
Academic.
I mean, I think that's much more the reason I said I'm happy to say I'm cisgender male. I just don't think there's much to unpick and problematise there. I think if I call myself a Jewish academic, that becomes much more complicated because
how so? Say more about that.
So technically, Judaism passes down the matrilineal line.
Yes.
My mother comes from an entirely Jewish heritage, therefore I am qualified as one of the chosen people, which is very nice.
You've been chosen.
I've been chosen. My dad's actually half Jewish. His dad came from a Jewish background, so that doesn't sort of count, but I suppose in terms of my grandparents or my great-grandparents, let's say 6 out of 8 were Jewish.
How do you identify with your own Jewishness?
Well, that's kind of where it gets complicated, because I was not raised remotely Jewish. I was raised very atheist, actually, secular atheist. I think I was dimly aware of the Jewish heritage growing up. And I got really excited, I guess when I was maybe sort of 12, 13 kind of age, when I discovered that my mum... So I always knew that my mum was from South Africa. That was kind of as far back as it went.
Old Rhodesia. Sorry. I cannot resist.
Yeah, indeed.
I cannot resist.
Indeed. Well, no, exactly. Isn't it interesting that I didn't really think... I mean, I think there was a point at which I thought, well, why aren't you black?
See, you said earlier you're afraid about all the pop culture references. You gave us the Mean Girl reference right there.
Straight away, yes, absolutely.
Well done.
Okay.
Gay card, can maintain it for now.
You know, I'm bringing my special brand of whiteness here. When I discovered, though, that we had Lithuanian heritage, this was me growing up in Exeter, southwest, you know, not exactly the most diverse place. So the idea of having Lithuanian heritage made me so excited. I suppose belonging to something bigger than the little world I was sort of growing up in, maybe. And so I found that much more exciting. He's taking notes.
I'm trying to.
This is what happens when you're doing it face to face. I can see all your tricks.
That's the thing, and also like my notebook is exposed.
I know, exactly. So I'm not
keep
looking.
going.
I'm sort of looking at a notional map of the Baltic region. So it was only in my mid to late teens that I started getting sort of interested in the idea of having Jewish heritage. Because for me, Jewishness was also very connected to studying RE, religious education at school, which I hated, which is ironic given that now I'm, in a sense, an anthropologist of religion. Another thing I identify as. So I just wasn't that interested. It was a sort of shift that took place, I suppose, 15, 16. This is all a very long-winded way of saying that I wasn't raised Jewish. I certainly have never experienced any sort of anti-Semitism, and I don't think that should be a sort
in
of
your life
benchmark for being Jewish. No, I'd be a little bit reluctant to just boldly claim to be a Jewish academic. I might talk about having Jewish roots, Jewish heritage. I certainly talk about how that's something that's very interesting to me, and if I sort of anywhere in the world I go, I'll always kind of try and seek out any Jewish history in a place, if there's a synagogue, whatever else.
Well, that's interesting, because like you were saying that there's a bit of an irony now that you're someone who writes a lot about Jewish identity and like belonging. That's why we're here today, to talk about your new book, isn't it? So can you tell us a bit about like your research?
Just to be very clear, it's not a new book in the sense that it's out, a finished product. It's a book that is slowly and painfully emerging from a 3-year research fellowship that's just
your
finished.
album is dropping.
Yeah, indeed. That will come sooner.
Before the book.
Yes.
Academic research. What'd you get your degree in?
I mean, actually, if you want to go right back, I'm undergrad, natural science. I studied cells, microbes, and then sort of moved on to whole animals. Things got bigger and bigger, and then I think I just sort of gradually realised that what I was really interested in was people.
Yeah.
I worked for 7 years as an environmental consultant, had a bit of a quarter-life crisis, I like to think of it.
Okay.
At age 30, I ran away to SOAS to become an anthropologist. Partly because, I don't know, inherent anthropological interest in the world. But a friend of mine had started an anthropology PhD at UCL, and I'd go to parties at her house sometimes, and her UCL anthropology lot were there. And I spent the whole evening just sort of grilling people about their research and just thinking this all sounds so much more interesting than what I'm doing on a daily basis, which is, I don't know, talking about solar panels. Very important conversation, by the way, but and so full of guilt to have abandoned that shit. But yeah, so anyway, I decided to do a PhD, and because I'd spent quite a bit of time in India for a range of purposes, teaching English, trying to sort of get into NGO work at various points. I knew India quite well, and I was fascinated by language. So I thought what I want to do is do a PhD, which will ultimately become a book, looking at language politics in Mumbai.
Okay.
Which, for all sorts of reasons that I probably don't need to go into in great detail, is a really fascinating topic that I felt hadn't really been explored that much. I was, gloriously unconcerned with the fact that I'm from Devon. I've got no roots in India. I spoke some Hindi. I didn't actually speak Marathi, which is the regional language there. With that great sort of sense of arrogance and entitlement, I sailed into SOAS, and no one really stopped me, which is quite interesting. And so I ended up spending a year researching in a neighbourhood in Mumbai. The book that emerged was very, very different from what I'd intended. It became actually a study of how did different people or different communities talk about history, and very different visions of Indian history depending on whether you're from a Hindu background or a Buddhist background. I eventually published that book in last November 2023. It's called Fake Gods and False History, being Indian in a contested Mumbai neighbourhood.
Love a colour.
You can get it for free on the UCL Press website. If anybody wants to review it, breaking the fourth wall here.
Trying to run up the streams. I see you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that was the first book. And after you sort of completed that project, what did you end up falling into? Doing, writing, working?
Do you remember in 2019, I don't know how much you might have followed this, in Birmingham, there were some protests outside a couple of primary schools. These were protests by the predominantly Muslim parent body of these schools, 90% Kashmiri Muslim neighbourhood. And the protests were about the fact that the schools were teaching LGBTQ inclusive content to primary school kids. And it's quite a kind of complicated saga, but it very much got framed in a lot of the mainstream media as basically the gays versus the Muslims. It was like, oh, okay, it's a liberal school teaching gay stuff, how lovely, and oh, these Muslims with their retrograde values, they're not, they're not integrating into British society, they can't accept homosexuality. So really, really simplistic sort of rhetoric about this. No kind of reference to the security agenda and the prevent counter-terrorism stuff that was in full force at the time. The nuance, exactly. In the sort of right-wing populist press, let's say, so in the Daily Mail and other sort of outlets like that, I kept coming across this idea of, oh, well, what are the left going to think about this? Because the left on the one hand love the Muslims, don't they? And they're supposed to be all supporting all the queers too. Ooh, people were like rubbing their hands with glee. It almost seemed that this was kind of really
waiting for the response.
Yeah, this would completely flummox
the narrative.
Left, and what's Owen Jones going to say?
Yeah,
and that really intrigued me.
I was just going to ask, what did Owen Jones say? What was that response?
Okay, so Owen Jones did put out a little YouTube video. I think he tried to be quite even-handed and speak to as many different people as possible. He was very clear that having grown up in Thatcher's Britain and post-Thatcher when Section 28 was in full force and couldn't really talk about homosexuality in schools, he was very clear that this is really important that schools do teach this material. But he also recognised the fact that these parents were mostly coming from very socioeconomically marginalised backgrounds, mostly migrant backgrounds. And I'm trying to remember how much he talked about some of the backstory, something else called the Trojan Horse scandal.
There's a great podcast about that.
There is.
The Trojan Horse affair.
Yeah, 6 to 8 parts.
I recommend everybody listen. That'll be in the show notes.
I don't think he did reflect too much on that. He tried to speak to some of the queer Muslim activists who were sort of trying to build bridges. So he talked to a guy called Kakan Qureshi, who I later got to meet, who's very much kind of involved in that sort of queer Muslim, queer South Asian space in Birmingham. I think basically his overall conclusion was, yes, we need to teach LGBTQ inclusive education in schools, and it can be done in an age-appropriate way, but this also, we cannot kind of use this as a sort of beating stick to further demonise Muslims. These conversations need to be had in a kind of respectful way. You have to work with the community.
Okay, so maybe this is a bit harsh.
Yeah.
And maybe just my perspective, but like equivocating in a way.
Yeah.
Is that what you'd say? Like when you said even-handedness earlier, as well as like the response, the narrative, from what I recall.
Yeah.
Being, let's actually just like put the queer Muslims to the front. The counter narrative that was pushed forth was the existence of queer Muslims.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, of another way of like progressive Islam as like being something that was being pushed by like quote unquote progressive left as like a counter to those narratives, which is something that's problematic in different ways.
You're right. I think there was this great effort to try and sort of highlight the voices of queer Muslims, who obviously all didn't have the same opinion.
And
Clearly.
like really not interrogate the actual relationship between sort of queerness and Islamic communities, both in, say, in the UK. The difficult part of this is that the thing being used to beat us with is something that has a grain of truth that's just sort of been exploited and blown up and transformed.
So this all happened kind of in the first half of 2019. It was really in September that year there was an intervention in the Independent newspaper. It was an open letter from, I think they described themselves as queer academics. A lot of them were queer Muslims, queer people of colour, a few others, a few sort of collectives. The Inclusive Mosque Initiative was involved, I think Maslaha. And they said, look, we need a new narrative around this. We need to actually inspect the extent to which this supposedly wonderful inclusive teaching programme, which is called No Outsiders, has actually been quite explicitly hitched to the prevent agenda. The idea being that, oh, well, if we teach kids to be respectful of queers, they won't turn out to be terrorists.
Yeah.
And that has been almost completely lost in the noise. And also we need to kind of, have a wider conversation about the status of Muslims in the UK and not then lionise these particular individuals as supposedly liberal or good Muslims or whatever. That's then formed the basis, I think, of a number of further studies and think pieces that have been done, but I don't think that landed in any mainstream sense, that narrative. And so I think if people remember this, it's very much still in that very simplistic, the Muslims versus the...
To bring that about your work.
Yes, exactly. So I got really interested in this idea of the left has a kind of close relationship with Muslims and maybe a problematically close relationship with Muslims. And again, for me, that kind of felt like it had a grain of truth in as much as, at SOAS, for example, which is a very sort of left-leaning university, very much felt that there's a lot of emphasis on combating Islamophobia, but also celebrating various Islamic studies in that kind of broader sense. I thought I ought to sort of dig deeper into this. So the study became an examination of this idea of left-Muslim relationship, yes. The way I'm framing it in the book is I'm asking the question, does the left have a Muslim problem? And seven other uncomfortable questions.
Right.
Intentionally provocative, intentionally a bit ambiguous, because I can imagine someone might see that title and think, okay, finally we're going to talk about Islamophobia in the left or in the Labour Party, which I do very much think about that. But the Muslim problem I'm sort of alluding to here takes one of two forms. It's either the left, and I'm very aware we're talking about the left in this very sort of fuzzy, amorphous way and not really defining it, which I think is kind of the point in a way, because I think that these labels often have power because they're imprecise. This is what I call the blind eye narrative, which you often hear from mostly right-wing politicians, journalists, etc., saying, oh, well, the left will happily call out or diligently call out homophobia and misogyny and anti-Semitism when it comes from the far right or from evangelical Christians or Tories,
right.
But they won't say anything when these are encountered in Muslim communities, which I don't think is true, by the way, but I can kind of see where that comes from. The other sort of side of that, and these are often linked, is what I call the unholy alliance narrative, because that expression is generally referred to as a sort of leftist, Islamist unholy alliance coming together and tearing down the fabric of Western civilization. It's like a red-green alliance. In France, this is called Islamo-Bolshevism, Islamo-Leftism. This has been floating around for decades, since at least the end of the Cold War. During the Iraq War protests in 2003, this was seen as a sort of coming together of leftist groups like the Stop the War Coalition and various Islamic organisations, which is true up to a point where those links being built there, and then has been deployed in various places, very much crept up in some of the rhetoric around the leadership of the Labour Party. And now we're seeing it in full throttle from people trying to discredit or demonise the pro-Palestine marches. I mean, the go-to example I often use is Suella Braverman wrote a piece in The Telegraph, I think in April this year, or might have been a bit earlier, and she literally said something like the Islamist cranks and the left-wing extremists have taken over the streets and they've hijacked the by-elections, which I think she's referring to.
You gotta appreciate someone who will always be their awful self.
Absolutely. No apologies there.
Taking over the streets, Jesus Christ.
And this was all part of her kind of bid to try and become the next Tory leader, which obviously has failed.
Her Farager,
a law and order, no nonsense, appealing to the... This just, I keep coming across this idea now. I hate being vindicated in a way, but this seems to have really picked up in the last year now, isn't it?
So I had a note here from what you were saying earlier about your first first study,
Yeah.
your current one, the first question, obviously, as someone who also does similar work that you do, which is like dealing with life history, and speaking to people about their cultures, to have them describe their cultures and like trying to, I guess, ascertain understandings and definitions from that, or like the themes that emerge from that. I find myself really like curious about your position as a researcher, especially at this moment. I asked you about your Jewish identity because obviously I've read your work and I know your work and these ideas that you're working with and developing. I just kept thinking about like, this must be really exhausting to write as a Jewish person at this time, who, even though despite what you were saying earlier as like someone you've not experienced anti-Semitism and like you have your own relationship with your Jewishness, how does it feel to be working about this now? But also, what are your reflections on your position as someone doing this right? I guess these are very different situations because you're writing early. Your first big project was in India, which is, like you were saying, a community that you weren't a part of, and you felt connected to in certain ways. This is now a community, but you feel less connected in certain ways. You see why I'm making that?
I see. I think the first project, the India project, the simplest thing I can say, I was a complete outsider. And obviously I spent time, I made friends. I'll never be an insider to that community. I don't have year-on-year kind of embodied experience of what it's like to grow up in India and just have all those experiences, but all those cultural references to hand. So
you can give like 6 pages to that person to have them say what their life is
like. Absolutely. But I try to be very clear in the book, Fake Gods and False History. That's where I'm coming from. I'm not making any sort of claim here. I don't know now, by the way, whether if I could go back in time, whether I'd still do a project like that. I have more problems with the idea of that outsider research. I don't want to do outsider research down. I think it's really important to have multiple perspectives, but I'm not necessarily sure that's something I want to be really part of. This project, leave aside the Jewishness for a second, I'll come back to that. Okay. I think it's quite interesting. I do feel a lot of outsider and insiderness. So my core research participants are queer Muslims and left-leaning Muslims, and it's very important to me to be sort of centering those, not just experiences, but also expertise. I hope I'm writing about people and treating them as experts rather than simply sort of raw material, but let's see. You can comment on that maybe.
Keep me out of this. Why am I in it?
No, but you've read some of the work. No, I'm not allowed to quote you. I know. I might quote from this. Once that's out in the public domain, it's free. I've got free reign of that. No, but I
colonizer to the
absolutely, exactly. Yes. So that whole thing about going back to the Birmingham thing. It was, I think, I hesitate to mention this person, Katie Hopkins, far-right journalist. She said something like, this is a problem that's incredibly awkward for the left, like, which way will they turn? On the one hand, they want to be the home of all things LGBT, but they also want to be incredibly tolerant of Muslims. Such a patronising thing to say, but whatever. I very much felt, well, okay, where am I in this? I'm left-leaning, I'm queer, I'm not Muslim, but I like to think I'm respectful of Muslims and Islams and opposed to Islamophobia. I felt very weirdly caught up in this nexus, to the extent that, as I say, the kind of, I suppose, my core set of interviewees or interlocutors or whatever you want to call them are queer Muslims. There's still that sense of outsiderness and that risk of extractive colonizing kind of research.
Disrespecting.
But so the Jewish piece is only one part of the study, trying to kind of use this idea of unpicking of this Islamo-Leftist narrative to try and understand narratives of anti-Semitism in the UK. I'm very conscious of not wanting to hide behind my sort of technical Jewishness, because as I say, I've not suffered at all as a Jew. I really don't think I have. I've got the benefit, I play the piano, I grew up in a musical family. I like to think that maybe there's a sort of something Jewish there. But so, although I do talk a bit about Jewish heritage in various places in the book, because I think that is important. There are some particularly left-leaning Jews who are very critical of what they would consider to be inflated claims of anti-Semitism at the moment. And I think it's a really important conversation to have. But I think it's much more compelling if that comes from someone who actually has been grown up in a very Jewish environment and has perhaps experienced anti-Semitism, because they sort of know what they're talking about. I think for me to come in and dispute claims of anti-Semitism as a matter of opinion wouldn't be that much different from anyone who wasn't Jewish doing it, because I just don't have that. I've never experienced it. I really don't feel confident to be able to speak on behalf of Jewish communities. Okay. It's a funny one. I think I'm still in the process of resolving this. And I think it's quite tempting to sort of self-exoticize myself or orientalize or fetishize myself, I don't know what we'd call it, and sort of play up the sort of Jewishness. And I don't want to fall into that trap, really.
I think it's also just important when you're doing this kind of work to place yourself Mm.
in the research and actually try and, like you're saying, process that and understand that and make a decision about what that means to you. I mean, in my own work, I think about that. Even like with just this episode, I think I mentioned to you earlier that something I really did want to mention, that this is the first episode where I am speaking on something related to my Arab identity. I've spoken about my queer identity. I've spoken about my Black identity, but like my Arabness is something that is only coming up. It's such a serious topic in a serious moment.
Yeah.
It's something that I often feel like I have to be very careful with how I present and inhabit in front of people.
Right.
That's why I asked you about like your position as a researcher, because my mind always goes to that whenever I read someone's work.
But in your work, I mean, for example, your PhD and the papers you've written, you also are...
I speak about my Arab identity.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
I do, but like that's different when you're writing it down. It's different when
It is
I'm
different,
writing a thesis, a dissertation, versus this is a different kind of project. Where, like, a lot of it is like me speaking about myself and my opinions, right?
Yeah.
But while the PhD, I mentioned that earlier, we're two people who really work with life history.
Yeah.
Is I spoke with a lot of men have sex with men who happen to be Arab.
Yeah.
And that formed the spine of my work. My opinions came out of that through their voices. That was really important to me. Like you were alluding at, it's like to center the voices of these people, guiding whatever motifs I see, whatever themes I see, whatever conclusions I draw from it. So a similar dual thing that I experienced, that you do working about something that in many ways is very personal, but also feeling almost dissociated from it, because I had to, like, in many ways think of my own self as just like a subject.
Yes.
Just like that's separate. That my experience or like subject is separate. I can reflect on, but I can't really, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's why I asked you about that. But like we were sort of been like eating around the actual chapter. So can you tell me about this chapter that you sent me from this book and what it contains?
Right. Okay, I can. Yes.
And why this chapter?
Very brief bit of contextualization. Going back to the books, I like to think I'm unpicking this idea of a left Muslim problem or an Islamo-Leftist problem, and I'm trying to understand where this comes from historically or genealogically, how it's used. So, for example, careerist Tory or Reform wannabes kind of writing articles in the Telegraph or trying to smear candidates in by-elections, whatever. How it's experienced by those particularly caught up in the sort of crossfire. So that's why I've spoken to a lot of left-leaning and queer Muslims. And also, what kind of grains of truth there are in there, because it's clearly a caricature, quite grotesque caricature in places, but caricatures don't come from nowhere. So I'm trying to sort of understand what is it that's actually going on that looks like this coherent idea of Islamo-Leftism. And then using that sort of framework to answer what I call these uncomfortable questions. So there are questions about gender and sexuality. There are questions about a question about migration. All big, chunky topics. This idea of the kind of left Muslim problem maybe offers a slightly different way in than we normally talk about.
Let's start at the very beginning. So the chapter's titled, Is the Left Anti-Semitic? Would you like to answer that question?
I try to be not too bet hedging at the very end, and I say, I'm actually starting at the end. If we slightly reframe this question to, is there anti-Semitism on the left? The answer is yes, absolutely. Of course there is, because there is anti-Semitism everywhere.
Yes.
Now, there are studies and surveys that show a higher preponderance of anti-Semitism generally on the right end of the spectrum, but that doesn't absolve the left. Going back to the beginning, I frame the chapter as a response to a book and a documentary by David Baddiel, a British Jewish comic, children's author, whatever else.
A
deep sigh all around. Hello, David, if you're listening to this. No.
Oh God, please don't. If you are, shut it off. Go away. I don't want your stream.
He wrote a book called Jews Don't Count, how anti-racism has failed one particular minority. He talks about progressives rather than the left necessarily, and he doesn't define what he means by progressives, which is quite interesting.
Well, it's useful, isn't it? Keep it vague.
It is, of course. Progressives, he argues, are hugely into anti-racism of all kinds, and they'll stick up for any sort of ethnic minority apart from Jews.
Right.
Jews, and he, I think, quotes an actress saying Jews are the one minority that get an eye roll.
Sarah Silverman.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
No one gets outraged about anti-Semitic football chants, which I don't think is true, by the way. I think there is. I think there's definite outrage about that. Yeah, his book is really sort of bringing together lots of what as he sees it, examples that sort of prove this thesis, and it was very well received. A lot of prominent British Jewish voices basically said, yes, this is what we've known all along, but no one's really said it.
Would you dissociate it as left-leaning?
I mean, I think of them probably more as liberal rather than left-leaning or socialist. So, I mean, Stephen Fry, I don't actually know how Stephen Fry defines politically. I say
moderate, I'd imagine.
Moderate, liberal, centrist, sensible, definitely not right-wing, but no, he's not a socialist, is he?
Friend of JK.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Very much seen as a kind of, this is common sense. This is like a kind of common sense narrative. Finally, someone's telling it how it is. But then there was also a very critical, and this was mostly a sort of left-wing socialist Jewish response, really picking this apart, questioning the way that he sort of tries to construct this idea of a hierarchy of racism, in which Jews are placed on the bottom, really sort of downplays or dismisses anti-blackness, among other things. How he really doesn't engage much with questions about Israel. In the documentary, at least, he says at one point, Israel, I don't really care much about Israel.
Yeah.
Point a lot of the critics make is you can't have this conversation about anti-Semitism in the UK without actually also talking about Israel and talking about Palestine. So my chapter, it's somewhat chronological. So I start off with a 20th century history of the Jews in Britain, and also history of the Labour Party's relationship to both Jews and to Israel.
If you could give us a brief overview of that.
I can, of course, yeah. So I actually open by alluding to a book by a man called Emanuel Litvinov, Journeys Through a Strange Land, which recounts his sort of 1920s East End childhood. And it's really striking the kind of experiences of people not pronouncing his name correctly at school, and him feeling shame when he walks past kosher butchers, his brother being forced to play the part of Shylock in a school production of The Merchant. It all sort of reminds me of reading, I don't know, sort of Akala's book about growing up black in the UK and sort of black many ideological. Obviously, lots of specific differences, but it very much feels like this is a poor, marginalised, minoritized, demonised community.
Then you track that?
I track that. I say it's a chronology. I don't go into great detail about what happened at every stage, but I think the Holocaust was clearly a big moment that forced a reckoning with supposedly liberal Western democratic relationships with their Jewish communities. That was the point really at which, particularly in the US, this idea of a Jewish entry into whiteness, which is very relevant to be your first white guest, Jewish guest. Certainly in the early 20th century, Ashkenazi Jews were not considered white, let alone Sephardic Jews or anyone else, but Ashkenazi Jews were very much a racialized minority. And that sort of gradually changed, I think, over the first half of the 20th century. First half of the 20th century, Jews in the UK, racialized minority, poor minority, accused both of being in cahoots with global capital, the whole kind of the Rothschild, those bankers sort of tropes, but also accused of being behind the Russian Revolution and of being communist.
This idea of Zion narrative.
Yeah, the idea of Judaeo-Bolshevism, which is an interesting trope, which I think is, in a way, you could sort of see as a sort of early 20th century version of Islamo-Leftism or Islamo-Gauchism, because it was, again, this idea that the Jews and the Bolsheviks were in this ungodly cabal.
Yeah, and then that was like maybe subverted with like the rise of the Abrahamic unity of religions, like in the War of Terror era. So,
absolutely, yes. As far back as the 30s and 40s, there was this notion of Judaeo-Christian tradition.
Yeah.
The people promoting that narrative are probably very different to the people going on about Judeo-Bolsheviks, but this idea was that this is what we need to protect against both fascism and communism, is our Judeo-Christian heritage. And I think it was the first time that the Jews had been kind of included in that. Gradually, in the UK at least, the Jewish communities, as we kind of went from first to second generation of migrants, third and beyond, there was a gradual shift towards sort of middle classness. Definitely the Holocaust would have been a huge game changer in terms of attitudes towards Jews and attitudes towards anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism became much more problematized, because how could you possibly endorse this idea that ultimately ends up in 6 million Jews being gassed?
Like in the face of cruelty, how could you
absolutely
deny it?
Yeah. Also, of course, what you have from the Second World War onwards, and then particularly in the 70s, is much more migration from Britain's former colonies, so from South Asia, from the Caribbean, and so you get a much more racially diverse landscape in which Jews, I think, gradually become much less other and much less different and much more closely associated with whiteness. I read about all of the skirmishes in the 70s, the very violent National Front meeting up migrants from South Asia and black people, and the organised Asian youth movements and this kind of idea of political blackness, where migrant groups, whether they were Sikhs in Southall or people of Caribbean heritage in South London or whatever, Pakistanis in Bradford, forming these groups and really kind of organising against the National Front. You did get Jewish involvement in those, but I think the role then would have probably been seen as closer to what we'd now call a white ally than necessarily we're victims of the National Front. Not to say that Jews were not beaten up by the National Front, but I don't think they were the primary target anymore.
As you were saying that, I asked you, and you were talking like the narrative of like sort of the position of the Jewish person in society. Another way of viewing that may be like the reshaping of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Right? Which is a big core of what you've written. sphere is talking about what is anti-Semitism today and how are we defining it.
Yeah.
So should we get into that a bit more?
Yes, I definitely want to get into that. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else that needs to be covered before we get there. Yeah, I'm very methodical about this.
You're very methodical about it. You're like step by step.
It's my chapter, bitch. Really key point, we will get there. We will corkscrew around towards this. Just one thing that needs to be said to kind of make that make sense is the relationship to Israel.
Right.
So again, as part of the story, what we have, of course, in 1948 is the creation of Israel. This was, I think, widely perceived as a plucky little socialist refugee state. The first country to de jure recognise it, don't ask me what that means in practice, was the Soviet Union. And very much the international left really had there was a strong support for Israel in its early days. Labour Party and the left of the Labour Party in particular were really supporting Israel. And actually it was people more aligned to the Conservative Party that were seen as being these romantic Arabists who went out to the desert and whatever.
Had the critiques and
the Orientalist Lawrence of Arabia type figures. They were seen
shining. Sorry.
Even I recognise that reference.
We sometimes
brings music. Bring some music into it. Yeah. I'll sing.
This will be the thing I'll take out for the musical episode.
Yeah, exactly. That's cheating.
Go on.
But yeah, so gradually, various different points, different sections of the kind of, let's say, the European and American left withdrew that support. And I think the Suez Crisis in '56 was a turning point. Massively, the 1967, the Six-Day War, which is obviously when Israel then occupies the West Bank and Gaza. That was a big watershed moment that Israel lost a lot of this left-wing support. But interestingly, some of those left-wing Labour stalwarts, including Tony Benn, who later on became a great kind of pro-Palestinian advocate, still maintained this quite staunch support for Israel.
What was the situation with the right at that point?
Okay.
Was there a shift there as well?
I think there was. Oddly, I'd say more in the US, sort of after 67 was the point at which being pro-Israel started to be seen as quite a patriotic position, because I think they really leaned into this idea of Israel being the vanguard, the frontier of civilization against, the barbarian hordes, which wasn't necessarily so much a position beforehand. I'm thinking of Norman Finkelstein's book, The Holocaust Industry. He talks about this. Weirdly, because the US was really trying to maintain good relations with West Germany in the 50s, it wasn't actually seen as very good form to talk too much about the Holocaust. So Jews in America, there wasn't this great sort of discussion about the Holocaust. Only until 1967 there was this kind of watershed, after which suddenly people got interested in memorialising the Holocaust, talking about atrocities. And as I say, being pro-Israel marked you out as the right kind of Jew, rather than a sort of problematic uppity one, which is what it had been previously.
So would you say that was the point where it became more enmeshed with what it means to be Jewish, is to also be pro-Israel?
Internationally, yes, that's probably right. Both from the Western end, if you like, but also Israel was really much more able to advocate for that, and there was a lot more organising and funding. That, again, we'll get to new anti-Semitism in just a moment because of that. But just to say, the Labour left, people like Tony Benn, only after, 1977, and the Likud Party was elected, so it was the first really explicitly right-wing government that Israel had. 1982 was the war with Lebanon and the Shabra and Shatila massacre. I think that was really the point at which people said, okay, hang on, what's going on here? We can't possibly associate with this anymore.
Like lines were drawn.
Right. And so that's the point at which really we very much see Palestine as a left-wing. Well, I mean, already that has happened, but I think that was really solidifying the idea of Palestine as being a broadly left-wing cause. Israel increasingly associated with the right. After 9/11 and the so-called war on terror, when Israel becomes part of this coalition of the willing, as George Bush called it, again really emphasising Israel as this frontier of the bit of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And as you said earlier, this idea of Judeo-Christian cultural unity then gets repurposed and mobilised against Islam, and political Islam in particular. That's sort of, you need the end of the Cold War for that to make sense, and then this whole new geopolitical shift. Alongside all of this, just to finish the brief romp through British Jewish history, not only so Jews are seen as white, progressively as a community getting richer, and there's very good statistical evidence about Jewish home ownership, salaries and all that kind of stuff that's current. It's not just some sort of horrible anti-Semitic trope like, the Jews with all the money. If you look at religious groups or ethnic minority groups in the UK, Jews are astonishingly successful. Probably attached to that, but it might not be the only reason, there was a gradual weakening of the very tight Jewish voter Labour Party link. So there'd been this extremely strong sense that Jews voted for Labour.
Right.
Just as often we think of Muslims and Labour, leave aside what's happened very recently, but there's that kind of link. That was traditionally in the 20th century, Jews voted for Labour. That was just how it was. There was more of a drift in the 90s onwards of some Jewish communities starting to vote more towards the Conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at 2010 onwards, it's the first point at which actually a majority, maybe quite a slender majority, but a kind of majority of Jews voted for the Conservative Party over the Labour Party, particularly in the Jeremy Corbyn years, which I'm sure we'll come to. We've gone from a point from the early 20th century where Jews were seen as a racialised, poor minority, very much tainted with associations with international socialism or communism, to now, I think, being seen as a white, wealthy, and perhaps quite right-leaning minority, tainted by their associations with, obviously, the State of Israel. So that's sort of,
That's literally the narrative.
That's sort of that first bit of the...
So, from what you were saying, you were giving us like the narrative shaping of Jewish identity, right? But then there's also an opportunity for us to look at a counter-narrative there, which is reshaping of anti-Semitism, of defining anti-Semitism, which is a big part of your chapter. So can you talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
What is anti-Semitism understood as today?
Yes, yeah.
And then let's get into the fight.
I mean, just actually go way back in time, one of the first big shifts, I'm thinking here specifically about kind of Christian anti-Semitism. We can talk about anti-Semitism in the Islamic world in due course, but focusing specifically on anti-Semitism within Christendom, which is where most of it was located throughout history. For most of the centuries ago, it was mostly about these people killed the Son of God, this child of deicide. Also, these people steal babies and drink their blood, or whatever, blood libel. Yeah, exactly. After the age of the Enlightenment, there was a sort of very theoretical sense of human universality, which meant that we can't really regard these Jews as subhuman monsters anymore.
Sure.
So there was this period called the emancipation that occurred at different sort of times, different places in Europe, I think later in the UK than, for example, France. But Jews became more integrated into society and were able to do different jobs. And there was this expectation that they'd sort of put aside their funny Jewish ways, as it were. And I think that's the point at which this whole association with capitalism and money really came to the fore. But it was less a sort of anti-Jewish religious bias and more anti this community because they're doing so well. So you'd say that
is when that became staple into the stereotype.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was, I guess, the first alteration.
That's the first, exactly. The first shift.
Anti-Semitism.
Yes. And so, throughout much of the first half of the 20th century, I suppose, anti-Semitism would have drawn from various of these wells, the anti-religious piece, but also the kind of anti-capitalist and anti-communist bit. It's only really in the kind of last few decades of the 20th century that we start to encounter the idea that opposition to Israel might be considered a form of anti-Semitism. That didn't sort of happen miraculously. I think that was the result of some quite deliberate effort on the part of mostly pro-Israel interests.
Okay.
There are probably all sorts of bits of this history that I'm going to miss, but from my understanding, what some of the key moments were, for example, in the early 70s, I think 1973, the Israeli foreign minister, Abba Eban, wrote, I think to a conference in Washington, that we should consider anti-Zionism, opposition to Israel, to be a form of anti-Semitism. So sort of really floated this idea. Then, just to sort of plug this, most of what I know about this history comes from a book by a man called Anthony Lerman, British Jewish scholar. He used to head up the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, I think. He's written a book called Whatever Became of Anti-Semitism.
Baby Jane? Whatever happened to Baby Jane?
I wonder if is that maybe, yeah. Whatever happened to anti-Semitism? And he really charts this shift in a lot of detail. Someone recently told me he thought the book was a bit conspiratorial, a bit too much conspiracy theory, but whatever. I think it's meticulous.
Worth reading.
Worth reading, definitely. So in the later 70s, there were, I think the president of Israel at that time was a man called Ephraim Katz. He convened these so-called president seminars in Israel, but I think also possibly in the US, and there were certainly connections there. That was specifically about, well, how can we really promote this idea that critiquing Israel is actually anti-Semitic?
Right.
In 1984, the year of my birth, just, centering myself here.
Oh, wow.
Well, actually, it's doubly interesting. The year of my birth, there was something called the Jonathan Institute in Washington. I think named after Netanyahu's brother.
Oh, fun. Love that.
I could be, we might have to fact check this, but yeah, there was a conference in Washington, and I believe, not Jonathan, but Benjamin, Bibi himself, was really there all over this conference, trying to rebrand Palestinian resistance, not as an basically Arab territorial struggle, but as a
terrorist act.
Islamic terrorist struggle. And so that's, I think, the point at which the sort of Palestinian movements start to get really sort of tainted with this image of, mad mullahs and whatever.
Terrorism,
all of that, exactly. And then I think once Israel becomes part of this coalition of the willing in the so-called war on terror, that link gets really sort of solidified because suddenly, Hamas, Hezbollah, whoever else are seen as kind of part of this other side.
And part of that other side, and then anti-Zionism becomes something that is associated with anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism, absolutely, exactly.
Right.
And it probably doesn't help that, I don't know if they still do this, but basically there's a lot of institutional level Holocaust denial in Iran. There is, some own goals to be scored here, and that's probably one of them. The idea that, of course, Israel is this kind of Judeo-Christian civilizational bulwark, because beyond that, all you get are these kind of raging terrorist anti-Semites.
And then from there, you kind of almost take that and then look at a case study of the situation with the Corbyn.
Yes.
So you want to talk about that a bit more? Or
I'd love to, yes. I just want to say that this this whole idea of anti-Zionism or opposition to Israel being a form of anti-Semitism, that's referred to as new anti-Semitism.
Yeah. The new anti-Semitism.
And not just by its critics, actually, but by proponents of this idea. So there were a lot of books published, I think, in the early 2000s, including by some French Jewish scholars, specifically about new anti-Semitism, and it really got sort of boosted as this idea.
I mean, that's really interesting, because I'm just thinking about the thing that inspired us to sit down here in the first place.
Yeah.
The Joe Biden speech about ancient hatred. So it's all this dual narrative of long established, I guess, Hatfield and McCoy's kind of beef.
Yeah. New anti-Semitism as a term, it's not necessarily a sort of critical term, it's actually a term used by people who endorse this idea that actually anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism. There was a paper by a guy whose first name I can't remember, his surname is Fischel, back from 2005, which was reviewing some of the literature on this.
Yeah.
And he makes the claim that new anti-Semitism is the preserve of a, and I quote, unlikely alliance, not unholy, but unlikely alliance of basically left-wing and Muslim sort of opponents of Israel.
Right.
You can see these tropes are already in place by then, the sort of left Muslim trope, as opposed to sort of, if you like, old or traditional anti-Semitism, which was really clearly about racism and sometimes nationalism. A lot of new anti-Semitism, Fischel and perhaps others argue, is actually couched in the language of anti-racism,
right,
and anti-nationalism and maybe anti-imperialism. So it's a much more slippery sort of category because it doesn't seem more traditional forms. Yeah.
Becoming more commonplace in a way. That's interesting. Just to double back on something you were saying, which is when you were talking about the forming definition of anti-Semitism and the shifting sort of goalposts and all that stuff. I've just been thinking about where these narratives were coming from. So with the Rothschilds or this Elders of Zion narratives coming back, right? And these perception about greediness that's tied with capitalism happening in, I'll say, the 70s?
Much earlier, actually. Right back into the 19th century, the capitalists.
Right. Yeah, but I was started thinking about the ways that, and I mentioned the 70s specifically because we're the oil crisis.
Yes.
About the ways in which those same tropes were also being developed in the Western region and weaponized against Arab nations and people and identities as a response to the oil crisis. It's interesting, how if we're talking about the right and the left, and we're talking about factions here, how both factions were using almost the same building blocks but aiming them at different people. So when you had the left beginning to sort of form these definitions of the barbarism, sort of Arab people, and greed and the wealth of these nations, and that becoming now, in modern day, something that we really associate and tie these Islamophobic concepts.
Yeah, and very more right-wing concepts in that sense.
But how the left was using that as a narrative. But then the right at the time was using similar narratives, but weaponizing them against Jewish people. Just wondering, your reflections on that.
I mean, actually, one thing just to say, it's interesting that we're talking about anti-capitalism here, as if that's necessarily a bad thing, but I imagine probably both of us are not huge subscribers to global capitalism, but I suppose it's more the idea of, certainly with the Jews, the octopus, the tentacles. I think that's Goldman Sachs was specifically compared to an octopus, which has its tentacles everywhere. I hadn't thought of that parallel before, but I think it's a really interesting one. And it very specifically applies to sort of Arabs from the Gulf, doesn't it? It's not something that would be used to slur, I don't know,
Egyptians,
Moroccan immigrants in France or Iraqis even, and far less so global Muslims. So
instead it's been reframed. But in the same way, it is something that became the idea of it's a trait. You know? So even if it's not associated with say someone from Egypt or Morocco, for example, it's still something that's associated with them in a different way. You know, being an inherent trait, even if they don't come from a country like the Gulf that's known for wealth and oil and all that stuff.
And I suppose maybe in both cases there's an association of vulgarity, isn't there? I think a lot of that anti-capitalist anti-Semitic tropes of the late 19th century and thereabouts was associated with an idea of Jews being rich and vulgar and not really having culture, which is kind of ironic, really, isn't it, when you think of how much Jews were also seen as at the vanguard of culture.
Well, it's interesting. I don't. Maybe I push back on that. I feel like the trope when it comes to Jewish people, when it comes to is like the hoarding or taking.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
While with Arab people, it's more like having. You know, it's like exorbitant. And I'm starting to think of those mega church narratives.
Oh, yeah.
Know, where like the people with like a lot of wealth claiming sort of undeserving.
Yeah.
That's maybe like my view of the prosperity sort of gospel thing. But no, that's kind of how I assess it. It's almost like a different strain, you know, like undeserving all that wealth and then like stealing wealth.
Yeah.
You know?
And it's also about property and land, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
With specifically the anti-Gulf.
Like there's an imperial
like,
strain. With
Qatar owns half of London.
Yeah, there's like an imperial strain with the way in which they're trying to colonize us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And of course,
the Jews are like betraying us, quote unquote. You know what I mean?
Because they're already here, I suppose.
Yeah,
so, yeah.
I think because of that thing with assimilation that's happened historically with like Jewish people, that there's anti-Semitic trope comes up in terms of like they're amongst us, you know, and like they're betraying us, and they don't actually belong here, but they've kind of like they've assimilated.
Yeah, and I think that was very much right back in the 19th century and perhaps even before, in this period of emancipation. Once Jews were not seen as internal other in that really extreme sense, but more like, oh well, they kind of look just like us. How will we know who they are? And in Nazi Germany, there was this whole preoccupation of trying to identify who were the Jews, and so that's why you had the nose and the calipers measuring the nose. Yeah, because it wasn't necessarily immediately obvious who was Jewish.
Yeah, well, it's like immediate. It could be immediately obvious who was Arab.
Yes.
Yeah. So it manifests in a different way because of how Jewish people, say Arab people, respectively exist as physical people in the world. Yeah. And I just think it's like an interesting complication.
I'm interested, actually. We haven't really, ironically, given that we're talking about Jews and Muslims, we haven't actually talked much about religion at all. But do you think the specific, call it the anti-Gulf narrative, how much is that also then linked to Islamophobia? It's quite different to the sense of, oh, these Muslim parents protesting outside Birmingham schools, importing their alien homophobia, blah, 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 blah. It's a very clear Islamophobic narrative there, and also an anti-migrant narrative. But when people are moaning about Sheikh of Qatar or Emir of Qatar, does Qatar have an Emir? I don't know.
I don't remember. Sheikh, it's going to be a sheikh.
Okay, whatever. The potentate of Qatar owns Harrods and whatever else. Is there also in that a sense of it being a problem that they're Muslim?
I think so.
Yeah, I think so too.
I mean, so I'm thinking about like this idea of the unity we were talking about earlier.
The Judaeo-Christian.
The Judaeo-Christian unity. The way in which, I think when I first mentioned it, I made a mistake of saying Abrahamic unity. But then I was like, actually, no.
No, because there's one very sharp division, isn't there?
Yeah, the thing is, there's something within the culture that the force is that we do not want them to assimilate.
Yeah.
They have not assimilated yet, you know what I mean? I think that's part of it, but because there's this perception of like the difference.
Yeah.
So I do think it's because of Islam. I do think that's like a big factor in it, yeah. And because despite how much we like to pretend, like Christianity is so deeply woven into this country.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, that means certain prejudices are woven into the country and how it operates. And also fears of self-preservation, you know? There's this other.
Yeah. And, you know, it took basically the Holocaust to allow Judaism to be woven into that fabric and not to be seen as an alien doctrine, an alien theology, an alien religion. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about continuing presence of... I should explain to the listeners, I do have your cat Alaska on my lap, and she took exception to my last point. So yeah, maybe we can
well, you know how Alaska feels about Jewish people and Arab people. She doesn't like anyone.
No, well, she's pretty very white. No ambiguity there.
She's sitting there in front of the mic like, what about my people?
Yeah, exactly.
We were kings in Egypt. Anyway. No, I do think that's like a very important factor. I do think it's also important that Arabs look different.
Yeah.
I think there is something about that idea of visibility and non-passing that is a huge thing.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting, isn't it? That until very recently, I think, in US censuses, were Arabs classed as white? Yeah. Which is curious, isn't it?
So...
Is it Biden time yet?
Yeah, I think we should start talking about that. Well, the reason we have this idea to have this conversation is the Joe Biden Ancient Hatred.
Which is the title, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, it is the title of this episode, so if you'd like an explainer about why. Yes. Joe Biden went up on stage and talked about the ancient hatred that the world has for Jewish people. Yeah. That ended up spinning out into narrative online and the internet. It became transformed somewhat into this idea of like the ancient hatred between Arab people and Jewish people. Yeah, I kind of wanted to get your reflections on that in the context of like what you're writing.
Yeah, so I tried to avoid this question question for as long as possible, actually. And I
Sorry,
think
girl.
in the chapter... No, I mean, not just now, but in my writing, I refer to it as the excruciatingly uncomfortable question of anti-Semitism among Muslims. But because, as I said, new anti-Semitism, the idea of new anti-Semitism is often ascribed to both the left and to Muslims, I think you can't just avoid it. I mean, if we're looking, first of all, at the contemporary picture... I don't think the data out there is very good, and there's lots of critiques of the kind of various surveys that have been conducted on sort of global anti-Semitism and trying to compare anti-Semitism between different countries and different communities. Such data that exists, though, does seem to point to there being quite high levels of anti-Semitism in many Muslim-majority countries, with huge exceptions. There's Anti-Defamation League Global 100 survey or something it's called, which I think we should be very, very cautious about for all sorts of reasons that Norman Finkelstein goes into.
Yeah.
I think, for example, Greece comes out as far more anti-Semitic than Bangladesh. But, you know, general big picture, there does seem to be quite a big problem in the Muslim world. And according to this survey, that's not all about Israel, because not all of their measures of anti-Semitism specifically kind of weed out Israel-related questions. And there's a whole conversation then to be had about, does anti-Zionism, even if we separate that out from anti-Semitism, does that potentially lead into anti-Semitism? And I think there's evidence that it can do. But anyway, all of that aside, I think this idea that there is this ancient, implacable, either Jewish Muslim or Jewish Arab animus just doesn't really have much bearing in reality. From my understanding, and I'm not a historian, but really Christendom, the Christian world, was by far the biggest location of sustained endemic anti-Semitism of the kind that we've been discussing. And there's a historian called Shlomo Dev Goitein.
Yeah.
And as a brief aside, I just want to point out that my surname Galton is actually an anglicised form of Goitein, or Goitein. I don't even know how to say it. Some sort of great uncle or something like that. Anyway, he wrote a book back in 1971 called A Mediterranean World, I think. It was about Jewish history in Arab lands. That's what the subtitle is. He draws on lots of different lines of evidence, but particularly some old documents from some Cairo archive.
Right.
And his conclusion is that anti-Jewish violence, let's call it, or discrimination, yes, it existed historically in the Islamic world, but it was local and sporadic rather than general and endemic, is the way he puts it. I think the way he sort of deals with this feels like quite an appropriate way to deal with it, because I think there is a temptation when confronted with these kind of quite simplistic, the Jews and the Arabs have been at it for centuries, to just push back at that and say, no, that's completely wrong, and maybe draw a slightly romanticised picture of how hospitable various Islamic countries, polities like the Ottoman Empire and parts of North Africa were to Jews. Yes, I think it's true that in general, Jewish communities were often able to flourish in the Ottoman Empire and in parts of North Africa and elsewhere, further east as well, in present day Iraq and Iran. But there were also periods of violence. If you look at the history of Morocco in particular, I think there were some quite grim periods in the 12th century under the Almohad dynasty, whereas both before and after that, I think Jews had sort of mostly got on fine from what historical evidence suggests.
I was born after Israel was established.
Yeah.
So my experience as a person who grew up in an Arab country, in a Gulf Arab country, discussion and mention of Jewish people was always related back to the history of Israel.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like when I try to think of like the idea of like the ancient hatred, I do sort of also reflect on some like the religious text and how Jewish people are discussed in that.
Yeah.
Though in all honesty, I don't know whether, as someone, I've read a lot of different, like I read the Quran, I've read the Bible, I've read like a lot of different religious texts. I don't know whether I want to say it's like more extreme in one versus the other. So I feel like it's important, like you've been doing, to like establish, yes, there is anti-Semitism in these places, but like it's more so the idea of working in a concerted, specific way. That's like what I resist. The idea of this ancient hatred, that narrative is actively used to gut conversation.
Absolutely.
On the topic. And that is its purpose. Yeah,
it's transparently used, isn't it, as a sort of, as a weapon, really.
And like it's transparently used, yes, but I feel like, I mean, I wonder why we've not managed to like surmount that. Why have we not beat it? Because, and I think the reason is because, like you are saying throughout this chapter, there is an element of truth in all these things, but like it operates in a very different, nuanced way. But instead, what we're seeing today and now is the way that is being weaponized. Right? And I mentioned that specifically to talk about how you discuss Corbyn in your chapter and what happened to Corbyn's career in relation to these narratives, associations with, I guess, quote-unquote Islamic viewpoints, his position in relation to anti-Semitism in the Labour Party specifically. And today, where Corbyn is today. And what brought him there. You want to go into that?
Yes.
And that's
Okay.
a lot.
Yeah,
That's a lot.
That's a lot. Now, I also then want to, there's some other things to obviously come on to as well with the current situation in Palestine. But gosh, yeah, the Corbyn, that whole saga was an incredibly complicated saga. The so-called Labour anti-Semitism
But
crisis.
also, I find it very simple. It is complicated, but also, like, in many ways, it's also very simple.
Yeah, I think lots of things are. I think lots of things you have to operate on different levels. But
Yeah.
I think what I mean is there's quite a lot of specific bits to it to try and grasp.
I mean, to give, like, a summation,
Yeah, I mean,
Jeremy Corbyn was ousted because of accusations of, like, anti-Semitism, the Labour Party.
I think that's too simple, though. I don't think that was actually the major factor at all. I think it was a factor. I think there were much bigger issues. There was no one liked his position on Brexit. I think the fact that he was also just relentlessly smeared by the media as this sort of weird socialist firebrand and incompetent and everything else. There was a very, very powerful establishment interests, forces, if you like, aligned against him. I don't want to kind of sound too conspiracy theory here. But no, definitely this anti-Semitism was a part of it. And there was this fairly widespread perception by the time, particularly the 2019 election, that the Labour Party was, awash with anti-Semitism. And somehow, no one really talked about anti-Semitism in the Conservative Party, let alone any other form of racism in the Conservative Party, but it was just sort of assumed that Labour had this anti-Semitism problem. One of the big sort of components of this, which takes us, I guess, straight back to new anti-Semitism. Well, in 2016, first of all, Labour, like many other organisations, adopted the IHRA, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, their definition of anti-Semitism, which I can't reel off to you right now, but
Included criticism of Israel.
Well, no, that the actual definition was just fairly sort of, I think, uncontroversial, and what you might expect a definition of quite old traditional anti-Semitism would be like. But this definition includes 11 examples alongside it, a couple of which maybe refer to Israel and suggest if you adopt this definition plus examples and endorse them, it really leaves open the possibility that any criticism of Israel might be vulnerable to being labelled as anti-Semitic. So, i.e. new anti-Semitism. And so Labour initially adopted this, I think, under Corbyn, but then in 2018, for whatever reason, it was decided that actually we want to kind of come up with our own modifications. So they retained the original definition, I believe, but just decided to get rid of those examples that specifically kind of referred to criticism of Israel. This caused a massive sort of media stink, and I think it was widely criticised, partly in, for example, the Jewish Chronicle, but also, generally sort of mainstream media. And it was only about a few months later that Corbyn, or the Labour Party, decided to actually just adopt the IHRA definition with all the examples in full. But I think by that stage, damage had been done. That had really cemented this idea of Labour being a very anti-Semitic party. And there were various investigations, none of which came up with anything particularly conclusive. There was a 2016 inquiry, so actually long before the IHRA sort of scandal, that concluded that Labour wasn't overrun by anti-Semitism. There was a later investigation by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission that suggested that the leadership by Corbyn could have been more effective in dealing with this problem had it chosen to do so.
Okay.
But it was only subsequently that there have been a number of more critical investigations into this idea of what was actually going on. There was the Ford report by Martin Ford QC that also came out in 2020, where he really sifted through files and files of internal complaints procedures and interviewed lots of members of the party. And his conclusion was that, yes, there are absolutely some genuine cases of anti-Semitism that have occurred in the Labour Party, kind of as you would expect, because there are going to be genuine cases of anti-Semitism and racism and homophobia and everything else in any political organisation. It's just humanity, I suppose. Why would Labour be any different necessarily? But, and it's a big but, there was also clear evidence that this was being used by the anti-Corbyn faction, if you like, the kind of what's called the Labour right, the Labour headquarters actually, against Corbyn and the leader of the opposition's office. There were clear examples of that being weaponised. Also, Ford acknowledges that these issues were perhaps downplayed by Corbyn and those around him, because I think it was already seen that this was being used as a sort of factional...
As a cudgel,
Yeah, as a cudgel, exactly. And then, more recently, in 2022, there was the documentary by Al Jazeera called The Labour Files,
right,
which investigated various different accusations against Corbyn. I think it was a 3-part documentary. One of them is specifically about the anti-Semitism crisis. Again, they acknowledge the existence of real anti-Semitism in the party. I don't think they perhaps maybe make as big an issue of that as they could. It's rather sort of, dismissed in a few minutes.
Yeah.
Again, it meticulously going through all the complaints procedures and concluding that actually a lot of what got categorised as anti-Semitism was not anti-Semitism at all. It was maybe sharing a Facebook post about 4 Palestinian kids playing football being bombed.
Right.
example. Or some sort of criticism of Netanyahu's policy, which I just don't think, even in the kind of extreme interpretations of the IHRA definition, I don't think would really be considered anti-Semitism. Interestingly, in that documentary and some subsequent work that's been done, I think it was calculated that the people by far the most likely to be the subject of an anti-Semitism complaint, as in the supposed perpetrators of anti-Semitism,
Tend to be Jewish people.
tend to be Jewish people.
Yeah.
If you're a Jewish member of Labour, you are 6 times more likely to be investigated for anti-Semitism and 9.5 times more likely to be expelled than non-Jewish members of Labour, which sort of suggests that maybe there's a problem with definitions, right?
Yeah. So, like, from what you're saying, I feel like, I mean, if we're going to take more of a meta reading of what you're writing, I guess what you're crafting is more of like, are you resisting a definition of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism?
Yes. I mean, I'm even slightly uncomfortable with the term anti-Zionism because I think it's such a broad umbrella that covers a range of different positions with respect to Israel. But yeah, I really...
Well, clarify it then. What would you prefer?
I just call it criticism of Israel, just because I feel that's more obviously heterogeneous.
There is a counter view that did give me pause quite recently that I don't remember who said it, but they were talking about their relationship to the idea of Zionism. Yeah. And the way they framed it, they suggested that the ideals of Zionism appeal to them. The idea of a place, the occupation does not. That is the struggle that they have with calling themselves anti-Zionist.
Right. Yeah.
Because there is that thing where they feel like Jewish people have been persecuted and need safety. So I wonder whether that's something that you feel...
I think that's what's often called liberal Zionist, actually. Yeah. That's partly why, again, I resist these labels, because you could certainly be very critical of the occupation of the West Bank, but not consider Israel in and of itself to be a settler colonial entity, right?
Yeah, I get that. I just
you could think just the existence of Israel is a colonial enterprise, end of story. There are so many different positions. You could have a different view about a one-state solution versus a two-state solution, the legitimacy of colonized people to take up arms in resistance, and so Hamas, etc.
Like, those are the nuances.
Those are the nuances, and I think, calling all of that anti-Zionism, or not even being sure where to categorize that, I just struggle with that. And I think for me, this is an ongoing debate I'm having with myself. I'm not there yet, but for now, in this draft chapter, and let's just be clear that this is very much in draft status, I've tended to shy away from talking about anti-Zionism and talked about instead criticism of Israel. Because I think there are probably people who would consider even criticizing Israel's actions in the West Bank, call that anti-Semitism. Yeah. Whereas some people might say, well, no, I'd consider you calling Israel a settler colony anti-Semitism, but let's call out the occupation.
It's the attempt to boundary, these conversations, the language that I find myself resisting. Yeah. So there's the Ta-Nehisi Coates New York magazine cover feature that just came out, I believe.
I haven't read, actually. I've heard about it.
There was a section where he was talking about where he feels like he wants to identify himself morally, where he identifies people morally. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he says something like the politician has less moral authority than the student protester who is out there, who might be using, and this is the important bit, using slogans that I might not use, might be chanting things I might not use, but the fact that they stake claim on their position, he finds as having more moral authority, a more ethical act, you know what I mean? And I don't disagree with that. I just find it interesting that we keep returning to the way we're speaking about things. You know? The things that person is saying, as opposed to the things that the slogans that person is saying. If they're saying from the river for the sea, and what that means, and is that anti-Semitic or not, and we're fighting about that, and we're dissecting that rather than like the actual issue.
Yes. I think that's a distraction there, isn't it? Really?
It is a distraction, but I find it like Ta-Nehisi Coates is doing it himself. You know what I mean? Because he knows that if he skipped that part and just says, but identify with a student protester, then that narrative of what that student protester is being called is stuck onto him. And that's something he has to be careful about. I find that to be...
Oh, okay, interesting.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I feel like that gap, I don't know, I resist it. But I do get what you're saying. We need to approach this conversation with nuance, being very clear about where our positions are about these different things. But that's a really long conversation. That'll take a lot of time for me to try and tell you. You know what I mean? So while I get resisting these definitions are useful in some way, this fight that we're having is a distraction to keep us from talking about like the actual events that are happening. Instead, we have defaulted to a place where the things we say about those events become an identity marker for us, rather than like we're actually talking about this.
Yeah.
And that prevents action. And that stalls the conversation, you know? That lets Keir Starmer step up and finally say a ceasefire must happen.
Yeah.
But not acknowledge the fact that they're funding. You know what I mean? Like, that thing is something that I resist. So I guess that's why I'm pushing back on it a little bit, you know?
Yes. I'm now everything you're saying
a bit
makes...
washy.
Everything you say makes complete sense. And yeah, I think a lot of the time these conversations are a distraction from actually
And like,
talking
I'm not trying to
genocide,
place pressure
but,
on you to be like, no, stake a claim. I'm just saying that, like, I'm glad that that's something you're engaging with.
Yeah.
And you're trying to think about, like, where do I lie in, where I am in
Yeah.
this position. But I guess I'm cautioning people to not spend too much time on that.
And I think I would probably,
Yeah.
and I'm always going to hedge my bets, but I think I would probably be, well, no, I have on many occasions described myself as anti-Zionist. I think where I'm being cautious is more in an academic descriptive sense, trying to talk about other people's positions.
Yeah,
The
you know,
label.
my frustrations with academia.
Of
is
course,
that
we
need to...
But I think just going back
Waste
to
of
your
time.
question, waste of time. I think going back to your question though, yes, absolutely, it's possible to be both anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic, and I think that probably really sort of blurs the boundaries of what's what there, doesn't it?
I say that as well because there's another side of it that I think is worth looking at, which is as these definitions are rising, there's another one rising, which is the idea that like these, I guess I don't know if I would say progressive values that we have about like this utopian vision of a world at peace doesn't have a place for these Muslim voices because this idea in the West of Islam is not belonging here, right? And that's what you're talking about, the Muslim problem.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Does the Muslim person, does the Arab person have a place in UK Labour or like not even UK Labour, but like this idea of like progressive future? Sorry, I'm like losing it. I'm trying to get something, but I'm struggling.
I'm trying to work out what
Can you
you're
help?
That's
anyway,
right, there's always going to be.
Drop back
there's
into what
always,
you wanted to say.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll make sense of it later on.
Yeah.
Corbyn.
One thing that I think didn't often get discussed about the Corbyn anti-Semitism crisis, for want of a better term, was a sort of accusation that was made by a range of different people, actually. Definitely some sort of maybe right-wing kind of news articles, but subsequently I've read there's an author called Rakib Ehsan who seems to make a version of this, and it was reported in Haaretz, which is a sort of liberal-ish, liberal-left Israeli newspaper. An idea that actually one of the reasons why Corbyn didn't stamp down on this terrible endemic anti-Semitism in the Labour Party was that he wanted to keep his Muslim vote bank on side.
Right.
Which, I mean, obviously that's all kinds of problematic because that then assumes that Muslim voters are going to be inherently anti-Semitic or are not going to care about anti-Semitism. But it taps right back into this idea of new anti-Semitism, doesn't it? Because it's the left, i.e. Corbyn and his circle, ignoring anti-Semitism to kind of maintain this link with Muslim voters.
I think what I wanted to say earlier,
Yeah.
actually I finally got it,
Yeah.
is that I kind of want to like draw attention to the fact that there's a definition sort of implicitly being created about like what the Muslim person is.
Yeah.
At the same time as that's happening. You know what I mean? It's like...
As in what? That
because they're being brought into the conversation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You were talking this idea about like the Muslim community is anti-Semitic and courting them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously not, but yeah, that's it.
Yeah, but like what I'm saying is that as that's being done,
Yeah.
that is sort of forming this definition of like this is what the Muslim person believes.
Right, okay.
That's
That
what
the
I'm trying
Muslim
to
is
say.
anti-Semitic or
Yeah.
homophobic or whatever.
Yeah,
To get
I was
these
saying-
things. And it's these crises that then sort of, I think, really solidify these labels.
And like we're in a moment where like these definitions are being created, but also they're being entrenched at the same time. You know. Anyway.
Well, I mean, that's absolutely what we're seeing now with the Palestine marches, right?
Yeah.
Because they're constantly being framed as somehow anti-Semitic. And again, who's on the marches? Left, Muslims. I think this narrative's almost reached its sort of... Apex. Well, I mean, goodness knows it might go further, but...
Is it solidified? Is it something that the culture believes?
I feel I don't know about culture believes. I think it's very much an idea that's in circulation and a lot of people would recognise. So this has all happened in the course of me doing this research and writing this book. I feel it's almost much easier to explain it to people now because there is such a kind of glaring and obvious example. And I think a lot of people probably, even friends of mine and people I know who, I'm sure they'd call themselves sort of sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and, clearly not sort of supportive of Netanyahu in Israel, but I think they probably do have this lurking sense of, but these Palestine marches, are they a bit anti-Semitic? And surely it's not right that Jews don't feel safe going into central London on a Saturday. I mean, I can only speak from my own experience and what I've read, but I've certainly not personally, and I've been to quite a few of these marches, I've not witnessed anything that I would consider to be anti-Semitic. Generally speaking, the arrest rates have been very low on the marches. And then some people say, oh, well, that's just because the police are too scared to interfere in political correctness, blah, 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 blah. But I haven't seen, I guess, a compelling argument that the Palestine marches are awash with anti-Semitism of any kind. I have seen quite a lot online, on Twitter, on some discussions. You know, it doesn't take that long on some Twitter thread for someone to talk about a hook-nosed Jewish bankers or something. But I think that's the online...
Yeah, I think the second march I went to in Brighton, the next day, the Daily Mail had like pictures of it. I was talking about like the anti-Semitic movement in Brighton.
Oh, right.
Streets. I was like, Jesus Christ.
Wow.
We're just walking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is another thing. Like, from my life, I remember when this first started happening, I got a phone call from my mother. I must have told you this.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
And my mother was like warning me not to go out.
No.
Yeah, and like to not publicly identify as feeling one way or another about this.
Yeah.
Because my career, but also because I'm in the process now of like sending my application for settlement to the Home Office, and so she was concerned about like what that would do for it, whether that might affect it.
Yeah, which is a very valid concern.
It is very valid, and that is something that I guess, from my perspective as someone who's Arab, who's here, that did play into how I participated with the moment and like the needs of the moment, and like how I could show up to a place. It was something in the back of my mind. I think I also mentioned all this stuff about belonging and all that stuff because that is a question that I have myself. The idea of like I'm not perceived as belonging because of my Arabness.
Yeah, with British society or
with like queerness.
With queerness, okay.
For example.
Yeah.
Or with British society, like you were saying, that's like an outlying aspect of me.
Yeah.
That, interestingly, my blackness obscures, you know, that allows me to sort of pass in a way.
Oh, right.
And so I often feel like...
Sorry, because the blackness obscures the Arab.
The Arab aspect of me.
Yeah,
and that is something I have in the back of my head, though. Like how my Arabness might change the mood of the moment, because it has before, in the context of me existing in British society today. And that's something that's come to the forefront in my mind over the past couple of years a lot more, as like stuff happened that has forced Arab people and Arab identity into the national conversation. And as always, that happens through a conversation about Islam.
Yeah.
Because something we haven't said already is the obfuscation, or like what do you call it, mashing up of Arab and Muslim identities as if they're one.
Yes.
And that is something we've not really touched on. The fact that, like you're talking about, Jewish identity and Jewish experience being very diverse amongst many different people who exist in many different ways. That same can be said about Arab people.
Yeah, we've just been erasing Arab Christians and Druze and whoever else, haven't we?
Yeah. And also, like, on that topic of ancient hatred, we've also erased the links between Jewish and Arab people historically. And we always talk about the violence, but also like the community that existed.
Absolutely.
And also the community that existed in the diaspora. You know, a lot of people in my life are Jewish.
Yeah.
My close friends are, specifically because of the similarities of like our upbringing, I find. And like our behaviors, so I feel like there's associations there, and that's something we often obfuscate. That the fact that like a lot of like in the practical, real day-to-day life, these things operate differently than they do in the political stage or the academic stage as well.
No, and I think there's so many examples of prominent Muslim scholars and organisations saying, "Well, no, as Muslims, we've got to be at the forefront of fighting anti-Semitism," and I think vice versa as well. I think one thing I found really heartening is seeing the depth of Jewish support for Palestine and participation. Obviously, I don't think it's necessarily representative of statistical British Jewish minority necessarily, but there's been a really powerful and organised and vocal.
I agree, because I think, and obviously I'm talking from the other side of this, but because like I feel I've had to be outwardly presentational of my feelings about Jewish people, and have to affirm publicly about being anti-Semitic. So seeing, you know, Jewish people really like show up for Palestine really did mean a lot to me. In a way, because I felt like, oh, okay, they felt that same urge.
Absolutely.
There's kinship in that. I found people.
And there's definitely, I think, politics there too, because I think it's almost overwhelmingly left-wing Jews who are doing that. Actually, I don't want to assume that, but that's certainly been my experience. There's going to be exceptions always, but there's definitely a strong kind of left-wing Jewish movement. Like, for example, the Jewish Voice for Labour, which was a Jewish faction that grew up around the Corbyn movement, not in opposition, but in distinction to, let's say, the much older Jewish Labour movement, which, well, not in recent decades, I think consistently has been fairly supportive of Israel, even though it was a kind of left-wing trade unionist organisation in its its early stages. Just on the subject of the Jewish experience in the Arab world, I think more of a plug than anything else, a book I read recently by an Iraqi-born British-Israeli historian called Avi Schleim, called Three Worlds. Essentially, he uses his family, and he calls himself and his family Arab Jews, as sort of evidence that you can't just simplistically divide that part of the world into Jews and Arabs or Jews and Muslims. And he documents this flourishing Jewish society in Baghdad. I think Baghdad was maybe not 50%, but a large 30-40% Jewish in much of the early part of the 20th century. And then he goes into real, quite meticulous detail about the changes in the 1930s, 40s and 50s that eventually led to the exodus of Jews from Iraq, and really busts the narrative that Iraqi Jews wanted to leave, wanted to go to Israel. They left primarily because of this terrible, endemic, ancient Arab anti-Semitism. It's a much more complicated story involving actually the British presence there. Lots of different factors going on. I think Mossad got involved at one point too. It's a really interesting read that I would recommend to anyone wanting to learn more about that.
You brought up the ancient hatreds again.
I did. I thought I'd just sort of drop that in there because I think Schleim's book really is a great sort of corrective to that narrative.
That is very true.
Yeah.
I guess it'll sort of bring us back at the macro. Really, in your whole writing, what it is like an advocation for us to look at these simplistic narratives.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And to think about the ways in which they delegitimize.
Yeah.
Let me try that again. Delegitimize.
Yes. It's a tough one. It's a tough one. Yeah, I always struggle with
revolutionary narratives. Really, right? Or not narrative, revolutionary positions.
Positions. Yes, and not
or
even,
opinions.
Yes, I don't think just revolutionary ones as well, but maybe kind of progressive ones more generally.
I just resist the term progressive.
Fine, fair enough. I'm very happy to resist that with you, actually.
I associate with liberal.
Yeah.
Which is another one I resist.
Or I often think of progressive as actually used to specifically not mean liberal in its classic.
I know,
but
sense.
But do you think?
But like both of them.
Yeah.
At the same time, I know both have associations that I don't.
Yes.
Like.
And we
but then again, I don't want to go for like independent because then I'll.
Oh no! Exactly. Yes.
I watched that documentary about anarchy and I did not like it.
Let's keep woke out of this as well.
I just want to set fires and take care of cats. That's all I want.
Very good. Yeah. Well, I'd certainly say to discredit left-wing politics, this Islamo-Leftist narrative, in my experience, from examples I've seen, it's been used, yes, to discredit left-wing politics, so Corbyn being one example, and also to demonise Muslim communities. I think one thing just to be really clear about, because I've sort of been talking about this as if the left and Muslims are two separate communities, and of course that's not true, because I think the majority of Muslim politicians in this country, the overwhelming majority, are left-wing and members of the Labour Party. Not that I regard the Labour Party in its current form as anything close to left, by the way. But yeah, Muslim politicians have generally aligned themselves to the left.
Similar could be said about the United States as well.
Sorry?
Similarly.
So exactly, yeah. And obviously there are exceptions, but there are, obviously many sort of left-wing Muslim activists and academics, and the Muslim vote, if we can sort of generalise, has also traditionally leaned left in this country. So there's a huge overlap there between those categories. I just want to make that point because I'm aware sometimes there's a dangerous tendency to sort of talk about things as if they're sort of very separate when they're really not.
I guess from my end, the thing I'd want to say is, and I have to be very careful about how I state this, given the conversation, is with all these kinds of things, I would encourage people to reflect on who do these narratives privilege, ultimately. Yeah. And in my opinion, they ultimately privilege, they enable state power to commit atrocities in the name of its citizens.
Yes,
right?
Manufacturing consent, basically.
Yes, that's what we're doing. And they are based on lies. They're based on stereotypes. They're based on fabrications. They're based on stories.
Yeah.
And the act of truth is a lot more brutal.
Yeah, they're based on sort of gross exaggerations and distortions as well. I'm always keen to sort of stress, or to kind of locate what is the kernel of truth behind whatever these narratives are. Just because I think it's really important to acknowledge that. Because if you don't, then you're automatically yielding power to someone who wants to critique your critique. They can just say, well, hang on, but actually, yes, look at that survey that shows such and such.
Well, hang on. Actually,
Go on, fine. Very good.
Thank you.
Absolutely hilarious. That's what makes referential such a witty and enjoyable
What'd you say about
podcast.
my podcast, bitch? You shut your mouth. Shut your whore mouth. Is there anything else that you'd like to touch on, Jonathan, that we've not covered?
We've covered so much.
I think you want to mention.
I mean, I think just the one bit of the chapter that we haven't really talked about, and I don't want to go into in so much detail, because it's quite depressing, is the way that Gaza sort of became an electoral issue in both the recent general election, but also there was the Rochdale by-election in February. It was February. there's huge amounts that could be said. I think I might save that for when this book eventually comes out. Please read my chapter.
Give us a snippet.
Okay. So I think just to acknowledge, in the post-Corbyn era, Keir Starmer has hugely sort of dragged Labour back from its supposedly far-left socialist fringe into some
Back to the middle right.
Back to the centre, or even further right, but who knows. We could argue about that at length. But anyway, certainly back to a sort of rather middle of the road. Not what I'd say is traditional Labour, but kind of maybe trying to emulate the more kind of Blairite Labour. And I think a huge part of Starmer's political personality, at least in the beginning, was not being Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah.
And so one element of that was he was very, very keen to distance himself from this taint of anti-Semitism, which is why I think one of the reasons why that was so cracked down upon in all these the subsequent investigations, internal investigations, I mean not the kind of board report or anything like that, but the internal sort of disciplinary procedures really, I think, privileged anti-Semitism as something that needed to be dealt with, because this was, no, I'm not Jeremy Corbyn, I care about this. So I think Starmer, and obviously for lots of other reasons, he was perceived as fighting a war on the left and on unions and all sorts of things. So he was very much kind of already not very popular with some of the more kind of left-leaning members of the party or voters, to include myself in that category, and I believe, Muslim voters as well, and obviously as already discussed, there's lots of overlap there. I think the nail in that coffin, let's say, was LBC, the radio show, wasn't it, the interview where he was asked whether he believed that Israel had the right to withhold no, not to defend itself, but also to kind of cut off water and electricity to Gaza, and he immediately said, yes, I do think Israel has that right. He then sort of couched this in terms of being in line with international law. That really felt like a turning point, followed by, I can't remember the exact what happened when, but the various ceasefire votes that Labour members were whipped against voting for that, or they were required to abstain. So I think that it felt like Labour was going to hemorrhage both left-wing and Muslim, and that intersection votes from those constituents. The Rochdale by-election in 2024, that was a bizarre story, actually. This needs to be sort of written about properly, I think, and I haven't got that capacity, because there were so many different plots and subplots. But the key story was that the Labour candidate, Azhar Ali, he was very unpopular among certainly the Muslim vote bank in Rochdale, because he was seen as very closely aligned to Starmer. But ironically, he was ultimately ditched by Labour because, well, firstly, he kind of was on record making a claim that he felt that Israel had let the October the 7th massacre happen. And then even that was kind of, he wasn't actually expunged because of that, but some other video came to light of him talking about Jewish quarters in the media being responsible for the suspension of another pro-Palestine MP, and that was a bridge too far for Starmer, so he was taken off. But he wasn't taken, it was a complicated thing, wasn't it? Labour stopped endorsing him, but it was too late to actually take him off the ballot. But anyway, then entered George Galloway, who's had a long history of being involved in British socialist politics and anti-war politics, and very much kind of has forged very strong alliances with British Muslim organisations like the Muslim Association of Britain back in the anti-Iraq war demonstration. His newly branded Workers' Party of Britain, I think I've got that name right, they really capitalised on this and sort of made the election about Gaza. And so when he eventually won, Galloway, first thing he said was, Keir Starmer, this is for Gaza. And I think that was why then later on Suella Braverman talked about the leftist extremists and Islamist cranks, or whichever way around it is, hijacking by-elections. I think that's what she was referring to. And then this certainly became a big part of the general election as well. And there's an organisation called the Muslim Vote, quite broad, I was going to say broad church, that's not quite the right thing, broad tent collaboration of multiple British Muslim groups. And they were specifically looking at trying to, first of all, identify candidates who had spoken out in support of Palestine, who had voted for a ceasefire, but also then funding independent candidates to actually take on certain constituents where the Labour candidate, or generally other candidates, was perceived as either leaning towards Israel or simply not engaging with that. Yes.
Why do you think Gaza has emerged as an electoral issue? Might be an obvious answer, but answer it.
I think because the British government is very clearly seen as aiding and abetting Israel, both diplomatically but also through sending money and weapons. Not obviously to the extent of the US, just because we're a smaller country, but it's not seen as some sort of far-off conflict that's got nothing to do with us, first of all. It's very much, there is British political culpability there, and British politicians voting for things of consequence, like, are we going to call for a ceasefire or not? So there's that. I think it's also, and this kind of connects to all the things we've discussed, and perhaps many things we haven't discussed as well, I think Palestine has become such a central cause, both for a lot of left-wing activism, and for a lot of Muslim community organising or activism and identity, and to keep stressing this left Muslim sort of overlap there as well. I think Palestine is a key part of that political identity in a way, and has been now for several decades.
The UK.
In the UK and the US as well, and Europe. But it's, I don't know what you think about this, but I feel that for a lot
I'm just thinking more so in terms of like not quite materiality, but like why are we talking about this now when this has been happening? Obviously not
because
this.
It's a genocide,
I know, but like yes, exactly. But because we're seeing it.
Yeah, we're seeing it. Oh, I see what you mean.
You know what I mean? That's where my mind goes. I was like, I wonder like the impact of us being more visible than ever.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true.
Also more immediate.
It's more immediate. We've got 24-hour coverage. People talk about it as the first live stream genocide, don't they? All the sort of social media ramifications as well. I suppose, it's there. It's very present, and it sort of feels like if you're even slightly political, you can't get away with not having a conversation and an opinion about it.
And I would say, I would just add on to that, I think that's directly because as a reaction to the fact that for a long time, you had to have a very specific opinion about it. And you couldn't share if you had a different opinion about it, right? Or is that just me saying that?
Go on, say more.
Well, I feel like there was, like we've been talking about, for a while it was really hard to publicly have an opinion about this matter. Because I'm a pop culture nerd and a past film scholar, if I will. And I keep thinking of examples in media where a discussion about Israel and Palestine was used as a joke.
Oh, right.
Yeah. I don't know which TV show I was watching. What was it? Might have been The Simpsons. And it had this thing where they were asking one of the characters, like, what's your opinion about Israel and Palestine as if a gotcha moment? And then it cuts away. And BoJack Horseman, actually, that's what it was. And then it cuts away and it returns to, like, the main character's, the final sentence, saying, like, and that's why I think it's a very complicated issue, but that's what I would do to fix it. And that was, like, a laugh line, and, like, it was an equivocating kind of thing, It's about, like, you can't publicly talk about this.
Right, It's complicated.
And, like, it's complicated. Exactly, it's complicated becoming the end of the conversation.
Right, yeah.
I think that it's partly this moment is a reaction to that. The fact that it's complicated, we have the simplistic narratives, we have like, no, but now we can talk about it. Now people feel more freedom to talk about it, which I find really cool. I find it really, really good that Chapel Rowan is saying. Yeah. Did you hear about that?
Yeah, I did. I did.
Like, that's something we should probably mention. Is the fact that, like, she's getting a very ferocious reaction from specifically the liberal left in America because she said, I'm not endorsing Kamala.
Yes.
Kamala.
Yeah.
Kamala. That she
and
said,
there's a whole science of how you're supposed to.
It's because I have. Stupid, I have a Marvel character in my head who's like said the different way.
Oh yeah,
I confuse them. Yeah. I'm not mean. But yeah, and so her saying that she didn't want to endorse Kamala specifically because of Palestine.
Yeah, I remember that.
The liberal reaction to that has been, like I said, really ferocious, really negative towards that statement, which I find to be like, really interesting. But I find it really inspiring, the fact that like she's standing on it 10 toes down.
Yeah. Kamala, who was it just this morning or yesterday, quite vociferously reaffirmed the US's
supportive.
The US's I can't really
get us cancelled.
Well, support for Israel. There's some specific formulation there, and very much Nasrallah was a terrorist.
Yeah.
End of story. But there had been some sort of sense that she might be moved. She'll carry on sending bombs, but she'll say slightly nicer things. She won't say it so loudly, whereas it sounds
like every other
loud.
Politician,
it sounds pretty
US
fucking
politician,
loud. Yeah.
And now here we are.
Yeah, here we are.
In the muck. Well, I think we solved it.
I think we solved it.
We solved the crisis. It took 70 years? Oh, sorry, it's ancient hatred. It took a couple of 100 years.
Thousands of years, exactly. And I think we should thank Alaska for her part. Yeah.
We were kings! Alaska doesn't care.
I was about to plug the next national march in solidarity with Palestine next Saturday, but of course it won't be next Saturday by the time this comes out. So,
there will be another march at some point.
There will be other marches, so
probably
get out in the streets.
Yeah, I'll post the details on that one. So what are our final thoughts? Do you have any final thoughts, or is that the end? What do you want to say to the people?
I think what I want to say, just actually more generally, so just moving away from the kind of specifics of what we've been talking about, also it frustrates me that it's complicated is used as a conversation ender.
Yeah.
And I suppose this is my entire sort of approach to the writing this book, and maybe the previous book as well. I want to, be in a space where you can embrace all this complexity and nuance and ambiguity without losing sight of your clear ethical and political commitments.
Yeah.
As I think I put it in, I don't know if it actually was a book launch event for the Fake Gods and False History book. I think, there are times when it's really important to be having these very sort of tortured, ambiguous conversations and kind of endless footnotes and endnotes. And there are times when you just have to get out and march on the fucking streets.
Right.
I think I think it's possible to operate at different levels.
Yeah.
So I have very clear views. Yeah, I think Israel's committing genocide. Happy to say that. I don't think it's much ambiguity there. I think it's certainly an occupying force in the West Bank, Gaza. Obviously Gaza's the historical sort of complexity there, but reeling you back. Well, no, but so someone's going to say, yes, but Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. I have slightly less clear-cut views on the question of. Well, no, I do believe it's a settler colonial entity. What we then do with that fact, I think, is where I start to sort of, see a variety of viewpoints. So I'm saying all that, but then obviously, in the chapter, which I hope one day will be published and you'll be able to read it, there's obviously endless little backwards and forwards and grey areas.
And if we can sit there and look at them.
Yeah.
And we can really think about them.
Yes.
But also when there's a genocide happening, we march on the streets to try and stop it.
Quite. That is my sort of my message, really.
Yeah, and if all else fails, then try to recognize cruelty and try to think of kindness and go, kindness must always be the option.
Yes.
The end.
Yeah.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. I believe this completes episode. I don't know what number this will be.
So many of them, yeah.
Hopefully I'll get you back here again at some point.
Yeah. Oh, am I saying goodbye?
Oh, actually, before that, this is something new I'm doing. Cool. I want to end every episode where I have my guests give the audience a recommendation of something. Whatever it is. It doesn't have to be of anything related to this episode. It could be like music that you listen to that will make their day just a little better. Something for them to check out.
Okay, I'm going to recommend something that I acquired yesterday. It's a magazine. I don't know how widely available it is yet, but I have great hopes that
I'll
this
put
magazine,
a link somewhere.
It's called Balkanism,
Yeah.
is prepared by a friend of mine called Arbe Gashi, and it's a sort of celebration of the Balkan region in all its knotty complexity, diversity, ambiguity, all of that. He's he's British born, but from background from Kosovo. There are contributors from everywhere, Serbia, Bosnia, Macedonia, you name it.
I love that.
Food, poetry, politics, a lot of queer history as well.
Ew. Oh, sorry.
And yeah, I hope it's something that becomes widely available and goes from strength to strength. So that's my recommendation, Balkanism. And I think weirdly, there are so many resonances with what we've been talking about. Actually, you could apply many of the sort of lenses, I suppose, that we've been applying to these questions of Israel, Palestine, Judaism, Islam, and all of that to that region too. So
lovely. And actually, I'm going to recommend something that we've mentioned earlier in this conversation, the Trojan Horse Affair podcast. Give it a listen. I think it will reflect into a lot of conversations that we're having and the topics that we have, and offers a bit of a good foundation to the conversation that we just had, I guess. Or not even a bit of background to what we've been talking about.
It's gripping.
It
really unfolds like a sort of detective, a true crime investigation.
Beautifully made. It's one of those podcasts that very much inspired me to get into the into the field. So high recommend. Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan, for coming on my podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Alaska.
Bye,
Say
world.
bye.
Bye.
Alaska, say bye. Bye.
And that was the episode. Thank you so much for listening. I gave you a long intro, so I'll keep it rather short on the outro. You can find Dr. Jonathan Galton at Jonathan Galton on Twitter. It didn't come up in this conversation, but Jonathan is also a composer. His latest album is going to be linked in the show notes, so please check it out. You can also find the podcast everywhere you listen to your podcasts. And you can find us on social media everywhere at AlsoPurp. That is ALSOPURP. That is going to be on TikTok, Twitter, Blue Sky, Threads, whatever I am forgetting about as well. We are also on YouTube. Just search for Referential Podcasts. The video version of this episode will be updated in a few weeks. We've got a video update coming your way in about a week or so, so keep an eye out for that. And if you'd like to get in contact, you can reach out to me at referentialpodcast@gmail.com or at KHALIDENNN@gmail.com. That is Khaliden with 3 N's at gmail.com. If you like this podcast, please leave a rating and review and share with your friends. It really helps get the word out there on Referential. And also, kind words are nice and probably needed right now, so I'd really appreciate that. And I think that is pretty much it for me. I will be back in your ears very soon. So keep an eye out on your feeds. Thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.
We all we got. So I'm gonna leave that there.
If you're a podcast host, listen up, this one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle, and I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial.